Good afternoon. It is 12 o'clock, so we're going to get started. Welcome to the Data Practices Potpourri webinar from the Data Practices Office. Thank you so much for joining us today. The Data Practices Office is a statewide resource on data practices and the open meeting law. We respond to questions all day, every day related to those two laws. And so if you just can't get enough of open meeting law and data practices, I encourage you to reach out to us and talk to us about your questions or issues that you may have regarding either of those laws. This PowerPoint is posted to our website, so if you would like to go back and take a look at it, it's on the page where you registered, and I will show you where that is. We also record our webinars, so if you missed part of this today or you want to go back and listen or watch again, you can find it and our prior series on our Data Practices Office YouTube page. And so I'm going to share my screen and show you where that is. This is our Data Practices Office homepage. We have a lot of materials and information about both data practices and open meeting law. So I encourage you to take a look at those resources if you have questions. Under events and webinars where you registered for this class, if you scroll to the bottom, you can see all of the presentation slides from our past webinars. And if you look right here at Data Practices Potpourri, you can see the October slides are down here at the bottom and available to you at any time if you want to go back and get a copy. Scrolling up here, you can see Data Practices Office YouTube channel. If you click on that, it takes you to our YouTube channel. Here it is. All of the past Data Practices Potpourris are here. We have a 4 or 5 part series on law enforcement data, on personnel data, on the open meeting law. We also had a couple webinars about data practices and open meeting law during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so you can take a look at those if you have particular questions around those issues. This is our agenda for our time together today. I am going to take a moment to share the PowerPoint with you so you can actually transfer it directly from this presentation right now. All right, so there should be a pop-up right now, and if you would like to download it, you may. I'll also do this later as well, so you have another opportunity. So today is our October Data Practices Potpourri webinar, which will be an opportunity to hear what issues data requesters and government entities encountered this past month and previous months. As usual, we'll leave some time for Q&A at the end of the webinar, so please feel free to send in your questions at any time, as you think of them, using the Q&A panel on your screen on the right. When you send in questions, please send them to all panelists so we can be sure that we all see them and we can answer them. If we don't get your questions answered during the webinar today, we will certainly follow up with you afterwards. So I'm going to take the file transfer down, but again, I will put it up again later, and it's always on our website. So for our first question, we have, I or my student received an email from someone I don't know about things happening in the school district. How did the sender get my contact information? We've had several questions around this type of topic recently, and the answer is likely that it is public directory information, and public data can be accessed by anyone for any reason. So in the Data Practices Act, Section 1332 makes identifiable data related to public school students private. It also incorporates provisions of the Federal Family Educational and Privacy Rights Act, which we call FERPA, and allows for some statutory sharing of data. But FERPA allows schools to designate certain information as directory information, which can be disclosed without parental consent, and the Data Practices Act treats this data as public. So directory information, again, is identifiable information about a student or parent that can be disclosed without consent when designated in the annual FERPA notice. Parents do have a right to opt out, and schools must provide a list of the specific designated directory information and the opt-out information at least once a year. So for the folks who have called in or questioned us about how their information might be disclosed to the public, it is likely directory information designated by their school district. FERPA also allows schools to designate limited directory information, which can be provided without consent to specific people or for specific purposes, which would also be identified in that annual FERPA notice. So what that means is that those data are still private, but that certain people have rights of access or for certain purposes. So for instance, this might be related to graduation announcement vendors or school picture vendors. They might get access to certain contact information so they can give information to parents and students about ordering pictures or invitations or things like that. So if you want more information about how limited directory information works with the Data Practices Act, you can take a look at Advisory Opinion 14-009. And now we have a set of questions about government data and recordings. We've had a certain number of questions recently around recordings, and so we have several here. A small division of a state agency is hosting a public listening session and would like to record it and put it on the agency website. Can the agency do that? This is one of those probably, it depends. There are some considerations about recording a listening session around the classification of the recording. So once an entity has the recording, what is the classification of the data on that? So consider who will be attending and what is the topic of this listening session. Will there be identifiable data on individuals that might be classified as not public? For instance, is this a group of members of the public who also receive social services and they're talking about their experiences? Threshold question is that something that you want to have recorded? And if so, would that maybe be private data on those individuals under 1346 once you have that recording? So in considering whether or not to record this type of listening session, entities should consider who will be attending, what is the topic, what is the classification of the recording after it is recorded. For public listening sessions where recording would just be public, the entity might consider giving a reverse Tennyson warning just to say that the session is being recorded and you're planning to post it to the website, and then people can decide whether or how much they want to share in this listening session. It's not required, it's just a nice thing to do to let people know that they might be going up on a website. And then a final consideration might be Section 1343, which is personnel data. And the question there would be, are the employees the identifiable subjects of the recording, or are they just incidental? Is this listening session really about the people who are coming to speak and give their opinion, and the employees are just incidental? If so, they're not the identifiable subjects, and 1343 would not apply. But that's something that government entities want to consider if they're going to be making these kinds of recordings. How about this recording? A city recorded a coaching session between an employee and a supervisor. What is the classification of the recording? This is probably private personnel data under Section 1343, since it's not in the list of public data in 1343 subdivisions 2 or 3. And so some of the considerations that a government employer might want to think about are, number one, a threshold discussion around, does this need to be recorded? It's important to remember that 13.05 subdivision 3 does have a limitation on collecting data on individuals, and we as government are limited to collecting the data that we need, only the data on individuals that we need to administer programs that are authorized by law. So the first question is, do you need this recording? To the extent that there is a business need that government has to record something like this, another question would be, are there private data about other employees? And to the extent that there are, does the entity have redaction capabilities? So I think that we have heard a number of questions around recording. Government needs to be cognizant of the technology that they're using and whether or not they have the ability to provide access to data subjects to the public if it's a public recording. And then do they have redaction capabilities? So government should not be collecting data or creating data that they're not able to then provide access to because maybe they can't redact it. So again, for this type of recording of a coaching session between an employee and a supervisor, I think the first question is, does it need to be recorded? But then once government has it, can they administer that data appropriately? And this one is for law enforcement folks. What is the classification of a recording of a call made to a police department non-emergency line that is not, i.e. not 911? So for law enforcement folks, you know that section 13.82 subdivision 4 classifies the audio of a call to the 911 system as private. But this is a recording made to a non-emergency line. So the content of the call is really going to determine the classification. Did the call become part of an active criminal investigation? Then the audio might be considered confidential or protected non-public. Remember that there are super public elements with respect to calls for service. Those are likely documented in the police report or in another place, and perhaps the audio itself could be pulled into that active investigation under subdivision 7. If the call identifies a complainant who's calling about a violation of a statute or ordinance about the use of real property, the identity is confidential, and the entity could decide that the person's voice or the information that they shared in the call is identifying. So that might be a consideration. Most other calls are probably going to be subject to the general presumption that data are public. So that proverbial kitten caught in a tree kind of call, that would probably just be presumptively public. So for these types of calls, entities are going to want to take a look at the content of the call to determine what the classification is and then what access would follow. Another law enforcement question, which is pretty specific to this provision: law enforcement may disclose not public data to dispel widespread rumor or unrest. What does this phrase mean in the context of public benefit data in 1382 subdivision 15? So that provision says that confidential, protected, non-public, active criminal investigative data or private non-public body camera data may be disclosed to aid in the law enforcement process, promote public safety, or dispel widespread rumor or unrest. So the question that we received is really about that last bullet. And we do not have any advisory opinions interpreting that language. I think it's largely up to the law enforcement agency to determine whether the need is there. The policy for classifying active investigative data as confidential and protected non-public is really to protect the integrity of the investigation. So the need to disclose must be equally compelling, basically. And there is this Court of Appeals case, Deli versus Hasselmo, that interprets section 13.39, which is civil investigative data. But that section includes the same language that active civil investigative data may be disclosed to dispel widespread rumor or unrest. And the Court of Appeals in that case said that ordinary rumors are part of everyday life, but the language contemplates rumors that threaten the community repose. So when thinking about the justification for using public benefit data, I think law enforcement agencies might also look to this case and the interpretation of that language when they're thinking about what rises to the level of dispelling widespread rumor or unrest. Turning to the open meeting law, does the open meeting law require public bodies to post meeting minutes on their websites? There is not a general requirement to create meeting minutes or post them to a website under the open meeting law. Minutes are referred to in 2 provisions of the open meeting law listed here, but neither require web posting. So there may certainly be provisions outside the open meeting law that public bodies must consider. For instance, charter schools meeting minutes do need to be posted to their websites under section 124E.07. So public bodies need to be aware of the other statutes that govern their work and record keeping. Question 7. The special meeting notice for the county board meeting says Wednesday, October 26, 2021, but October 26th is a Tuesday. Does the board have to repost? The answer is yes. Section 13D.04 subdivision 2 requires date, time, place, and purpose for a special meeting notice. If the public bodies include the day and date and one is incorrect, the notice does not give the public the information needed to attend the meeting. So I can anticipate some argument that the strict plain language is met if the date is correct, even though the day is not. However, I think including the wrong day casts doubt on the accuracy of the date. So interpreting the law in favor of openness and the public, as the courts tell us we should, the meeting would still probably need to be reposted. All right, the legislative session is right around the corner. I know a lot of folks are preparing for that. So we have this question, which is, I don't like fill in the blank about the Data Practices Act or the open meeting law. How do I change it? Right, and here are just a few strategies for improving or clarifying or changing these laws. The regulation of open meetings and classifying data is squarely in the hands of the legislature. So contacting your elected officials, your members of the public, if you're in government, you have your lobbying organization and your intergovernmental affairs folks. The Legislative Commission on Data Practices is meeting. It's a bipartisan group of legislators from both houses that meets monthly to discuss data practices issues. And I think they are certainly interested from hearing from members of the public and government about data practices. And so that's another place that you could reach out. In general, the Data Practices Office does not take policy positions with respect to legislation unless it specifically impacts the work of our office. But we work with members of the public and data subjects in government. So we generally try to stay neutral with respect to policy changes, but we're happy to help draft or brainstorm ways that others might brainstorm ways that others might want to change or clarify or improve either of these laws. So please feel free to reach out to us and we can help with those things as well. All right, so those were some of our top questions from the last month or so. I'm going to put the PowerPoint up again. We have some time for questions, so if you haven't sent them in already, feel free to put them in the Q&A panel to all panelists. And again, if we don't get to yours, we will definitely follow up with you afterwards.
We have a couple questions that have come in already. I'm going to start with the first one that asks, what is the open meeting law? So we answered a couple questions today about the open meeting law, but in general, the open meeting law is a law found in Chapter 13D of Minnesota statutes that governs and regulates the meetings of public bodies. So this is generally the school board, a local city council, your county board, and how they should notice their open meetings and when they're allowed to go into closed session.
Okay, so we have another question here. How long should someone wait after making a data request before following up on the request? In other words, how long is reasonable to wait for a response to a request? And so this is a good question because the Data Practices Act doesn't set a specific time period for when requests need to be responded to. It's simply that the requests need to be responded to in an appropriate and prompt manner and within a reasonable amount of time. And so the response time can really vary depending on the complexity and the amount of data requested. And so sometimes it may be just a couple of weeks, other times it may be a couple of months depending on the request. And so what our office often recommends as a government entity, keep in touch with the requester and just kind of from that customer service perspective and maybe give them updates every now and then about the status of the request. Coming from the requester perspective, certainly it's reasonable to check in with the government entity and provide any information that they ask for clarification, because that will help facilitate a request. So again, it all depends based on the context of the request.
Another question that came in was, would DPO, the Data Practices Office, assist with brainstorming possible changes to data classifications housed outside the DPA? Yeah, if you have a question about how a classification could be implemented or how to phrase a classification or the consequences of certain language that would impact data access or classifications in Minnesota, we're happy to discuss those potential changes. just so everybody knows, if there's silence, it's because we're trying to read the questions that are coming in.
So we have a couple of questions here about how to specifically request, certain files or to send in a data request, just generally. So the best guidance that we can give, and so I'm looking at one here where there was maybe a data request sent in earlier this month, and still someone hasn't heard back from it. You can certainly follow up with the government entity. They may be currently putting together data. They may also be looking to see whether or not they have responsive data. Oftentimes, and this kind of gets to the second question here, the exact wording of the request. Oftentimes, requesters may have a little more success when sending in a data request to a government entity when citing specific statutes. And so if it's for specific law enforcement data, perhaps citing 13.82 subdivisions 2, 3, and 6, those specific public elements that are identified in the law. That may be a useful way to kind of clarify or point to the request. Additionally, when you're requesting data, try to be as specific as possible, and describe particular incidents, or if you have a case file number, certainly identify that. And then, of course, as you're working with the government entity or trying to get the data, certainly be responsive to any requests for clarification, or ask the government entity to say, hey, what would help to clarify this request? That may be a useful way to ensure that your request is processed as soon as possible. But if you ever do have questions about submitting a data request, you can certainly reach out to our office, and we're happy to talk with you through the various provisions in the Data Practices Act that you might be able to point to when requesting that data.
While we're waiting for additional questions to come in, I'm just going to post a poll in the polling panel for some feedback and some ideas on future webinars, but please keep your questions coming in. Thanks.
We had a question about directory information, and it is a recent data request by a school district requested student directory info, including name, birth date, grade, home address, and parent names. Is this all considered directory information? So every school district is actually going to be different. Each district gets to decide if to have directory information and what they're going to include. And so that, again, is designated in their annual notice. And if you're a member of the public, you can certainly request that notice from the school district to see where they've designated those directory information, or if they have not designated anything as directory information, then identifiable information on related to students is generally private.
We have another question. It says a public employer wants to include a sample tenancy warning in their personnel policies. Is there an example you'd recommend? So we don't have sample tenancy warnings on our website compared to our sample informed contents that we do have on our website, because with tenancy warnings, they are so specific to each instance of private or confidential data collection that they should be tailored to that specific collection and what that particular data will be used, how that particular data will be used. So we do not have any sample tenancy warnings.
Okay, we have one kind of related to copy costs. It says, any ideas on how to charge for electronic data while still allowing people to view it first? So for electronic data, just like any other government data, members of the public, data subjects can inspect it, they can take a look at it for free. That's always going to be free. So we can't charge for inspection as government. In terms of if they want you to make a copy of it and they want to take it away, electronic data is actual costs. So if it's public data for a member of the public, you can government can charge for the time it takes to search and retrieve the data. If you're putting it on a CD-ROM or a thumb drive, you can charge for the materials. Otherwise, if they're just coming to look at it, then you can't charge for that.
Okay, so we have another question here of, do you have any examples of a data inventory list policy? And we actually do have copies or example model policies of all of the required policies that you can find on our Data Practices Office website. It's under the area saying Data Practices, Rules and Requirements, and then Policies. And so I'll just repeat that one more time to help out there. So if you go to our website, and if you highlight the area that says Data Practices, highlight the area that says Rules and Requirements, and then you should be able to find policies right there, where we have model access policies, the ensuring access to not public data example policy, as well as an example of the data inventory. So as you're working on those various statutorily required policies, you can use those as some examples.
I have another question. An employee lodged a complaint alleging gender discrimination in a toxic work environment. The complainant wants to know what happened after their complaint, what can be released. So if the complainant made a complaint against other individuals or other government employees, we would look to 1343, which is the personnel data section of the Data Practices Act that discusses what data are public about government employees. If the subject of the complaint, so the person the individual complained about, is just a regular government employee, while an investigation is pending, the existence and status of a complaint or charge against an employee is public. So only the fact that a complaint exists and the status, so possibly that it's pending. Once the personnel investigation is complete, whether additional information becomes public depends on whether there's any disciplinary action. If there's no discipline, it's just the existence and status that is public at the government entity. If there was discipline, then we go to Minnesota Statute 1343, Subdivision 2A5. And that section says that the final disposition of discipline, together with the specific reasons for the action and the data that document the basis of the action, are public data. And so if somebody was disciplined as a result of this investigation, that discipline and the specific reasons for the discipline and the data documenting the basis of the action would be public.
All right, I think we have time for one more question, and this is also a copy cost question, which is, can you charge if the requester is taking photos of the documents you provided for their inspection? So there are a couple advisory opinions from the Commissioner of Administration that say that if someone, if a data requester brings in their own scanner, it's kind of an old one, and makes their own scans of paper copies, that's still inspection. The government has not been asked to make a copy that the person is taking away, and therefore they cannot charge for that. There's also one about someone bringing in their camera and taking pictures. So in general, you cannot charge for someone making their own copy using either their telephone or their camera. Government can only charge when government has made a copy, has been asked to make a copy that the requester is then taking away with them. All right, so that's our time for today. The poll has been open. Please let us know your feedback, what other kinds of webinars you would like to see from our office. We are very happy to read that feedback and to create content that is interesting to you. Stay tuned for a Gov delivery notice about our next webinar if you have joined our listserv. We're also hosting a law enforcement workshop on November 17th. This is a paid workshop and registration information is available on the workshop page of our website. Again, if you have any requests for certain data practices or meeting law topics, please let us know. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate it. Have a great afternoon.